Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com or at the YouTube Sonic Cinema podcast page. I'm pleased to be joined today by a friend and filmmaker, Matthew Saliba. We talked about his work. We talked about working at movie theaters and just movies in general last year. This year, he's going to be joining me not only for my class of 1999 series with a bit of a biff and deep cut choice for that year, but we're also going to be discussing today the legacy of Godzilla, the iconic Japanese kaiju monster whose latest American adaptation, Godzilla King of the Monsters, is going to be coming out in May. So please welcome to the podcast once again, Matthew Saliba. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me again.
I'm I was actually kind of excited about the idea of talking with you about Godzilla because I know you're a pretty big fan, and I mean that's part of what excited me about the possibility of talking about the the uh, the movies and the legacy on movies that Godzilla has because he does cast a pretty large shadow in movies. I think both in certainly in Japan where he's a tremendous icon on par with any American film icon, but also I do think in terms of some of the things we've seen in American films over the past half century since the original Godzilla came out in 1954. I do think he's certainly had an impact on American movies as well. How did you get? How did you become such a fan of Godzilla?
Well, that's actually a pretty interesting story. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this the last time I was on the show, but long before I had any goal or intention of any kind of career in film, I actually wanted to be a paleontologist because I love dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, none of these tapes still survive, but I have it on pretty good authority from my family that when I was young, they would actually film me doing really lengthy lectures about all the different kinds of dinosaurs there were, and I would have all these toys and do little plays with them. And then I was also really into monsters at the time. And so when you really stop and think about it, Godzilla is a perfect combination of two of my biggest passions at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and still to this day. So in a nutshell, I would say that's probably how I got into it. Um, my earliest memories of watching movies are of watching Godzilla films. I think the very first VHS tape I ever owned was a copy of King Kong versus Godzilla. Either that or Godzilla versus Megalon, because I also remember that at some point. And also, I mean, the oldest possession, I mean, forget about DVDs or anything like that, but the oldest possession I have is this maybe like a 2 or 3 foot Godzilla toy that I have taken with me from apartment to apartment and across provinces when I moved. So, you know, so yeah, I mean, as long as I've had a breath in my body, I don't think there's ever been a moment when Godzilla hasn't been a part of my life, one
Mm-hmm.
way or the other. As a matter of fact, I even own a Godzilla onesie. So, so yeah, suffice it to say, I'm definitely a kaiju enthusiast.
What is it about? Because I mean I've watched I know when I first started watching movies. I mean I've watched the original King Kong. I watched I think the first Godzilla movie I had ever seen was actually the awful Raymond Burr edits of the original Godzilla that American audiences saw, which was called Godzilla King of the Monsters. with Raymond Burr just shoehorned in as an American reporter following the events of the 1954 film. And it admittedly it wasn't until I haven't really whenever I think of Godzilla, I just think of very cheesy guy in a suit, uh, movies, monster movies of destroying Tokyo and destroying and just really goofy monster cinema. Um, what is it about? What is it about those films? What? Okay, I guess what I want to ask is what misconceptions of Godzilla movies do you think that maybe some audiences might have if they've like never seen one before?
Well, you kind of hit it on the head just earlier. So by the time Godzilla films made their way to North American shores, um, you were you were I mean, obviously the original '54 Godzilla, the uncut Japanese version, actually didn't make its way to North American shores until 2003. As a
Mm-hmm.
matter of fact, the first time I saw that version was on a 35 millimeter print at the Fantasia Film Festival here in Montreal.
Oh wow.
So so it wasn't just. I mean, unless you were a really hardcore collector who would track down 14th generation Bolivian bootlegs of the original copy. Yeah, I mean, like most people, we grew up watching the badly dubbed versions where Raymond Burr was sort of strategically edited into the film, which it's interesting because as a filmmaker, I as much as I think that's sacrilege, I also kind of appreciate it from an editing standpoint because in some cases they did a pretty decent job of making you think he's actually there.
Yeah.
Um, well, again, I think the biggest misconception is that um, Godzilla is just any sort of monster. I think because people didn't grow up watching the '54 version in its original incarnation, I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people miss what the metaphor that Godzilla stood for. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure most people listening to this know the story, so I won't bore people with the details. But I mean, obviously, Godzilla was inspired by King Kong and of course the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and of course it's Godzilla is a metaphor for the horrific attacks on Hiroshima and
Mm-hmm.
Nagasaki, and so when these films were brought over to American shores, any sort of criticism of the American government or the United States was edited out or dubbed over uh, to sort of make the films more in line with the sort of science fiction films that were being released at the time.
Right.
So I think people grew up thinking that these films were sort of cheesy popcorn movies, which in some respects they are to a certain extent. I mean, by the time you got around to Son of Godzilla, it's safe to say any attempt at sort of philosophizing about the attacks of World War II have been long gone.
Yeah.
But I do think that many people forget that Godzilla was a very serious,
Mm-hmm.
daring art house film that deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, which
Mm-hmm.
came out the same year.
Yeah.
And but then again, imagine if you will that let's say I'm thinking about the 1990 Batman films. Like imagine these films were originally released in another country, and when they finally made their way to American shores, the first one we would see would be Batman and Robin.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like obviously,
Yeah.
if that's your experience with the Batman franchise, you would think, what the hell is this? So I mean, keep in mind that by the time Godzilla films found their way to American shores, we were talking about like the eighth or ninth or 10th part of a 35 film series. So
Right.
obviously, if that's your first experience, you're going to think, oh, okay, well, this is just silly.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, also, I certainly don't want to discount the silliness too, because the camp and kitsch factor of these films is obviously something that's very appealing too.
Mm-hmm.
because in many respects they also give you a little insight into Japanese culture. I think it's actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Invasion of Astro Monster, where Godzilla and Rodan are sent to Planet X to fight King Ghidorah. I think at some point Godzilla, after the fight, Godzilla starts jumping in the air and he's doing a dance called the Chi, which was like a Japanese craze in '65. So it is, and that's been sort of memed and gifed to death.
Yeah.
But that's kind of interesting because it's cheesy by our standards, but it's that was a very popular thing in Japan at the time. So, but yeah, I think overall the biggest misconception is that it's just sort of popcorn entertainment without any real substance beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And again, I would certainly, every time I try to introduce people to Godzilla, I always try to, I always believe in, if you're going to explore a series, you should try to do it in chronological order if possible, just to sort of see the rise and oftentimes fall of a franchise. So I would always try to start with the 54, and if that's not available, then at least the ones from the classic era.
Yeah. No, and I definitely I would definitely suggest people go see the 1954 Shiro Honda Godzilla as well. It is part of the Criterion collection. It's part of my collection. When I first saw that, and it was a good. It was a few years. I think it was a few years before the Gareth Edwards 2014 film in the American franchise came out, and when I first saw Honda's the original one from 1954, I was just blown away by it. I was, and it's because of that metaphor that it represents a trying to deal with the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki within the confines of this popular entertainment. And it's really striking the way that Honda does it. It's such a beautiful movie. It is a movie comparable to the original King Kong in that respect, and in the way that it deals with the hubris of man, as well as wraps big metaphorical ideas into genre, and the way it uses that genre to tell the story is just fantastic. And I love, and I feel that way. When I was watching the 1954 film again before recording this episode, I still feel the exact same way. It's really a fantastic film to watch.
And especially when you consider that the film was made really not too long after the events of World War II. I mean, we're talking. I mean, by the time this film, if I'm not mistaken, I think the film was actually shot around 53 before it was eventually released in 54. So, I mean, when you really stop and think about it, it's more or less within the same. It's not even. It hadn't even been a decade since the event. And so, because I recently, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but I had a chance to read a biography written about Ishiro Honda. It's a wonderful book. It's got a foreword by Martin Scorsese, who turns out that he's a big Godzilla fan. Who'd have thunk? And reading the circumstances behind the making of the film, and particularly with Ishiro Honda, because the Japanese film system had the studio system had a system where if you were breaking in, you would start off as a third or a second assistant director, and then you would eventually work your way up. But Honda kept getting drafted into various conflicts and wars at the time, and so by the time he got back to directing films again, some of his peers, including Akira Kurosawa, who started after him, had sort of graduated to being a full-on director. So Ishiro Honda had quite a bit of a struggle before he even got around to doing something like Godzilla. So it really just a filmmaker standpoint, I really appreciate the circumstances behind the making of the film. And there's something pretty interesting, and this also go back for one of of your original questions about why I like Godzilla. What I especially admire about the original Godzilla is what I tend to admire about genre film as a whole. One of the great things about whether it's horror, sci-fi, fantasy, is that these are films that work on two different levels. On one hand, if you're just going in for the entertainment value, you're going to find that and more. But really good genre films allow filmmakers and storytellers to address political and social issues without necessarily being obvious about it.
Yeah.
Because, you know what I mean? Because, like, on a surface level, for someone on the outside looking in who never read a history book in their life, would probably Godzilla, and you could admire it on the same level that you would admire, you know, like the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, for example. But if for those of us who have studied history and know the story behind the making of the film and the story of that country as a whole, not only is it a very entertaining film, it's also a very enlightening film as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what's kind of interesting too is that when you move into some of the other movies that would follow the original Godzilla, Ishiro Honda was very much a globalist in the sense that he really believed in the power of the global community coming together and putting aside whatever pet differences they might have and come together for the idea of fighting a conflict that affects mankind as a whole. And so it's very interesting in the sense that you would think that with what happened after World War II, there would be this resentment towards the United States, that they would want nothing to do with the country after what they did to them. Yet Ishiro Honda seems to suggest that we should maybe certainly not forget, but perhaps forgive and move on, which is kind of something I wish contemporary filmmakers would take heed of, opposed to holding grudges. So that's very interesting, because especially in films like King Kong versus Godzilla and Mothra, and once all these other monsters were introduced, it was very interesting to see Japan and the United States working side by side in spite of what happened in the 40s.
Yeah, and that's one of the things in the handful of Godzilla movies that I've seen from the Japanese run of the character. I've definitely seen those, the way that it casts each film can sort of cast Godzilla in a completely different way, and sometimes he's a villain, for lack of a better term. Sometimes he's a good guy, protecting Japan from different some of these different monsters, and that's one of the interesting things that I like in what I've seen of the Godzilla franchise that Toho has done over the years, and it does make me, even especially seeing as many as like a few of them in succession, like I did like I tried to in preparation for this episode. I definitely it definitely gets me interested in watching more and more of these.
Oh yeah, and I mean, again, the great thing is particularly with the classic era. I think Criterion acquired the rights for most of the classic Showa era Godzilla films, and I know there was thought at some point of putting them out on Blu-ray, but I think they might be available on Filmstruck. I think that's their streaming channel that they have. And yeah, if you get a chance, you should. I mean, I would argue you should watch all of them. But I mean, if you were, but there are 35 films in the franchise, so and there's only so much time one can realistically spend watching movies.
Right.
So I mean, if you were to restrict yourself to perhaps only one era, I would definitely recommend the classic era.
Mm-hmm.
If for no other reason than to see the arc that Godzilla goes on, because. Yeah, you're right. For the first, I would say 3 or 4 films, he's definitely a villain, to the point where he doesn't really get top billing. Honestly, I think up until I think it's only Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, which was in the 70s, where he got top billing. So he was always sort of a villain for the early part. But I think it was in Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, where well, wrestling fans would recognize this terminology, but this is where he turned babyface, because And it's interesting because I'm just thinking about this right now, but because in the film Godzilla and Rodan are fighting as they're wont to do, and then a greater threat makes its presence known, and they put aside their differences to team up and fight King Ghidorah. So that, in many respects, just confirming the theme of the global community that Honda is really interested in. That's actually a perfect example.
Yeah.
These coming together in light of bigger threats.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Before you go on, I do want to say, unfortunately, Filmstruck is no longer a streaming service. I do want to clarify that. Unfortunately, Filmstruck went out of business, but I do know Criterion has another streaming service that they are getting up and running this spring. So,
okay. Well, I'm really bad.
Well, that's all right. I mean, yeah, it happened a few months ago. I can't remember when exactly, but yeah. And I will say, if anybody has the Stars app, I know that there are some of the older Godzilla films are on there, or they have been on there. So that's some place to find them too.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm definitely been out of the loop. Are the kids still watching Beta these days?
I think that went out a long time ago.
Oh, but yeah. So I mean, if you do watch, like, there's 15 films in total for the classic era from 1954 to 75,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, Godzilla definitely goes on a bit of a roller coaster as far as character goes. As I mentioned earlier, at some point we discover Godzilla has a son.
Yes.
We're not really sure how that happened, but, but he just shows up all of a sudden, and it's funny because I don't know if you've seen Son of Godzilla.
I have, actually.
Okay.
It's been a while, but I've seen Son of Godzilla. Yes.
It's funny because the way the film ends. Spoiler alert for anyone listening to this. Basically, the humans get away because they launch a weather device that freezes the island. And one of the and this is actually a testament to, because we didn't mention this, but the actor who played Godzilla for the longest time was a gentleman by the name of, and forgive my pronunciation here, his name is Haruo Nakajima, and he to his a testament to his ability as an actor, because again, as much as we've been talking about metaphors and symbolism, at the end of the day, these are guys in rubber suits fighting each other. So let's call a spade a spade. I mean, and this shows you what a tremendous actor he is. There's a scene where when the island starts freezing, Godzilla's son starts crying, and then Godzilla takes his son in his arms and he hugs him, and then the camera sort of tilts up, and like you see snow gradually piling, and they sort of hibernate together. And at least for me, for personal reasons, I'd rather not get into. But for me, I just found that to be a very profound moment, to the point where when I saw that for the first time, I actually got a little teary-eyed.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it was a very moving moment, and it's moments like that where I think get glossed over when people talk about Godzilla, because again, it can get cheesy, but that was actually a very, very sweet moment that credit to everyone involved with that scene.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like the more of the Godzilla movies that you watch, I think, yes, when you first hear, oh, it's just a guy in a suit, that sounds really cheesy, especially when you consider how King Kong moves as an animatronic character in the original. But the fact of the matter is, the more Godzilla films that you watch from the Toho run, that expression, the expressionism that comes through it being an actor in a suit, is what is ultimately a big part of what the appeal of those movies are. And it's because of the fact it's very much in the same way as why performance capture is capable of so much right now, and why it's really a natural succession to makeup effects because of the fact that you have the actor performing it.
And yeah, and that's a very good point, because I think, again, a very big part of the appeal of these films is the fact that what you're seeing is actually there. It's
Yeah.
not CG. It literally is someone in a suit, and not only
Mm-hmm.
that, but it's also a testament to the way these films are shot, because
Mm-hmm.
obviously you're trying to create the impression that Godzilla is however many stories high. You've got to shoot him a certain way. You wouldn't shoot
Right.
Godzilla the same way you'd shoot a regular actor.
Right.
And actually, at this point, I'd probably like to. One thing we should. I don't think you can really talk about Godzilla without talking about the man who, the genius really, who brought these visual effects to life. And once again, boy, I'm gonna try to get the pronunciation right. His name's Eiji Tsuburaya. So he's one of the grandmaster of visual effects, a man who deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as people like Willis O'Brien or Ray Harryhausen.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who did the special effects. And what was really interesting, and I found this out while reading the biography on Ishiro Honda, was that while Ishiro Honda would direct all the things involving all the scenes involving the humans, like all the actors and such.
Yeah.
And Tsuburaya would direct everything involving Godzilla. And these would actually be, I know that sounds like a practice that's done today, where sometimes the visual effects are off doing their own thing, but
right.
In respects, these were two separate films being filmed at the same time. There would be some consult back and forth, but Tsuburaya had complete autonomy over how he would want to shoot the effects, to the extent that sometimes Ishiro Honda would have to reshoot stuff with the human actors to correspond with what Tsuburaya was doing with his work.
Right.
So it's interesting, because I almost feel like Tsuburaya should get a co-director credit for a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Just because, without the work that he did, this whole series wouldn't have taken off, really. And he would also, he kind of went on, I think, if people don't know him by name, they would certainly know his company, Tsuburaya Productions, because probably the most famous thing that he ever did outside of Godzilla was the Ultraman series.
Okay.
So he did he started with Ultra Q, which was kind of like, the best way to describe that would be the Twilight Zone meets Kaiju. And that's a really interesting series. And then from there, you had Ultraman, and then Ultra 7, and the plethora of Ultraman series that would come out after that. It would basically be sort of like, Ultraman was kind of like a giant Power Ranger who would fight, the monster of the week, pretty much.
Yeah.
And that was a really fun series. So that's probably what he's best known for outside of Godzilla. So yeah, I think he deserves quite a lot of credit too for the success of that series.
Yeah, and in just talking about it, just in thinking about sort of my own experiences with the franchise, it does make me want to just sort of dig in more and more into some of the older films, and it's like, it makes me want to watch. When you were talking about the embrace of Godzilla and Son of Godzilla earlier, it's like, it makes me want to rewatch that movie again to sort of see what you're talking about, because it's been a number of years since I've seen that. I think this is one of those things where, and it occurred to me, I think it occurred to me in watching at least the original Ishiro Honda movie again, and watching, as much as I really, I think the 2014 movie that Gareth Edwards made, and that the sequel King of the Monsters is coming out with and is coming out for in May, I think it's a solid film. I think it's a solid adventure film for what it is.
Well, it's funny, because I have a bit of a fun story about that 2014 Godzilla film.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was 2014 was the year I moved to Toronto from Montreal, and so one of the very first things I got invited out to in Toronto was the Toronto premiere of Godzilla. A friend of mine invited me, And unbeknownst to me, Gareth Edwards was actually there to do an intro and a Q&A.
Oh, wow.
And so, and it was interesting because when we were watching the movie, he was sitting a couple rows behind my buddy and I. And by the time we got around to the Q&A, I don't think he was he was none too fond of me because I kind of made my opinions about that film pretty clear. I guess we can start talking about that a bit then. So, first off, for the record, I do think, if nothing else, I think the 2014 film was successful in eliminating the memory or nightmares that people were having about the '98 Godzilla, that
Right.
Roland Emmerich.
Right.
So I'll acknowledge that much. But I didn't really care for the 2014 Godzilla film for a few reasons. One, now, I'm not going to complain about the lack of screen time for Godzilla, because one of the things that I think everyone seems to forget is that when you do watch the original '54 Godzilla, or any Godzilla film for that matter, even a film like Destroy All Monsters, which at the time featured every kaiju ever made, 3/4 of the time of the screen time is devoted to humans.
Yeah.
Because that's, at the end of the day, this isn't Quest for Fire where nobody speaks English. Well, actually, none of the characters speak, or they don't. None of the characters speak. You know what I mean? Like, it's like you do need human beings for audiences need, to see themselves reflected on the big screen to be able to relate to what's happening.
Yeah.
So I never really minded the lack of screen time for Godzilla. That's fine. My only problem is that they killed off all the interesting characters within the first act of the movie. You know what I mean? Like, you had Bryan Cranston, at the peak of his career, just coming off Breaking Bad and whatnot.
Yeah.
And especially with the way the film had been promoted in the trailers, it certainly made it seem like it was going to be Walter White versus Godzilla.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word. But so right off the bat, they killed him, and I think they also killed off the Juliette Binoche character too.
Because she dies in the very first scenes. So
yeah. So and then what we're left with are, they certainly gave it a go. They tried to make it as empathetic or sympathetic as possible, but the characters weren't terribly interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's a problem when 3/4 of your film is devoted to beings who audiences are having a hard time feeling any sort of emotion for.
Yeah.
So I certainly feel like that was a mark against the movie. I also felt that the Muto, I think that's what they were called, the Muto, the creatures.
Yes.
They weren't the sort of best choice for a villain. I wouldn't have gone with them. If anything, they kind of reminded me of the Godzilla film from, I think, 2000, Godzilla Megaguirus. They kind of reminded me because they were sort of insect-like. And that's not one of the more fondly remembered films. So, when you consider the rogues gallery of monsters that they could have gone with, that wasn't. It was it was an interesting choice. Interesting, the Hollywood sense of the word.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing for me, and this was also my issue with the '98 film, is that it was written. The film seemed to be done in a way where it seemed to assume that audiences knew who Godzilla was.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? Like there was a little bit in the prologue explaining how Godzilla came about.
Right.
But that, this wasn't an origin story.
Right.
And as tedious as origin stories, and this is something I've noticed that's happening, this is something that seems to be happening in the Marvel universe too, where, when they introduced Spider-Man, he didn't really have an origin film, or or Black Widow or any of the other characters. And, the thing is, and maybe I'm in the minority on this one, but as tedious as origin stories can be, I honestly feel that if you're establishing a new timeline, a new universe with a character, however familiar that character may be, I don't know. I don't know the origin of this particular incarnation of Godzilla.
Right.
Like or again, like and a good example of because some people feel that for these iconic characters like Superman, Spider-Man, Batman,
Yeah.
you do the origin story. But I would disagree. And a good example of how you can do an origin story right would be Batman Begins.
Mm-hmm.
There's a film that, and I would argue, as much as everyone loves The Dark Knight, I still think Batman Begins is the best of that trilogy because not only did it break all the rules about origin films, it added something new to the Batman canon. Because I've read a lot of Batman comics, and I don't ever seem to recall that origin story being told in the comics.
Right.
To the point where that has become, like, Batman Begins has now become canon in that universe.
Yeah.
So I feel that, for this, especially since this was the kickoff to the whole monster, is it the it's the MonsterVerse, with Kong and all the we're doing.
Yeah.
I think it was really imperative to establish who this was, especially when you consider that to the average Joe Pinchpenny who doesn't follow the Toho films, they probably still think of the '98 Godzilla. So, some people might, well, wow, boy, Godzilla put on weight between '98 and 2014. What happened?
Yeah.
So, and also, and I'm glad you brought this up because I was actually prepared to talk about, if I was making my own Godzilla film, how would I do it differently? But see, you mentioned, like, you were talking earlier about, one of the biggest misconceptions that people have of Godzilla, that it's just this cheesy popcorn entertainment. And I feel like the 2014 film didn't really do anything to change that, because it didn't establish who Godzilla was. People just sort of look at him in the same vein that they would look at any sort of atomic age monster, that it doesn't stand for anything. And I thought that they missed an opportunity to really reinvent Godzilla for American audiences, because I feel like one of the reasons why Godzilla maybe isn't taken as seriously as he's taken in Japan is because, obviously when Japanese audiences see Godzilla, they remember, the horrors of World War II, whereas American audiences just see this giant monster. And I felt that, they missed a big opportunity, and at the risk, I mean, this might sound like a bit of a cliche idea, but they really, like, especially in the States, in light of what happened on September 11th, I mean, they missed a golden opportunity to turn Godzilla into a metaphor for what happened on 9/11.
Right.
See, if I was directing that 2014 Godzilla, what I would have done is have a prologue, showcasing what happened on September 11th, and then my story would revolve around the idea of trying to fight terrorism. And there would be obviously the plot with the war, but also there would be a subplot where scientists discover the serum that can turn that they said that if they inject it into or cells, that it can turn into this huge destructive force that can help fight the war on terror without sacrificing human lives.
Okay.
But so they would create, in fact, a Godzilla. And so, but then, much like how, the Patriot Act and things like that might have been launched with good intentions, inevitably those things came back to bite them on the ass.
Yeah.
And so this would be like, so, maybe Godzilla would initially be a force for good, but, much like, again, the thing with the Patriot Act, Godzilla would turn on the United States and so on and so forth. So that would be a way to sort of, create a Godzilla that American audiences could identify as a uniquely American phenomenon. And and then
that I will say, and I mean I sort of agree. I do agree with you about the 2014 film, and that's one of the things that I was getting at when I brought it up was the fact that it's like and your idea right there is really interesting, and I think that's one of the things that, as much as I like the 2014 film, as much as I'm interested in what they do in the follow-up this year, I don't think, like you said, like they're really the people making these movies are just looking at them as monster movies. They're not adding anything of real depth to them in terms of how do we connect Godzilla to our experience, much in the same way that Ishiro Honda did in the original Godzilla, and that's exactly what it was going for, and the fact that that's why ultimately anything American audiences do, unless somebody really decides, okay, I'm going to go all out here, and does something really personal with it.
Yeah, and also just as an aside, if anyone from Legendary Pictures is listening to this, that I patent pending.
Yeah.
But no, so that was sort of my issue. That again, there wasn't any attempt to sort of Americanize it.
Yeah.
Which is kind of ironic because a lot of the criticism that Hollywood gets when they remake foreign movies is that they take away the sense of identity from those respective countries to try and try to make them relatable for Americans. So it's interesting that it seems like they're almost trying to respect the fact that Godzilla is a Japanese creation. Mm-hmm. But I feel if you are going to establish a universe where much of the action takes place in America, I almost think you need to Americanize Godzilla in a way, and that would have been a perfect opportunity to sort of tie it into that, because then with Godzilla King of the Monsters, you could continue that metaphor, because now I think in that film they're bringing Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah. Well, if America created Godzilla to fight the war on terror, then maybe Iran created King Ghidorah, and China got Mothra, and Russia has Rodan. These might seem like obvious bits of symbolism, but it's a way to add a little more sizzle to the steak, as it were.
Yeah, and I mean that. Yeah, now I'm not sure how much I'm looking forward to King of the Monsters after this discussion, because we're really I still want to see it, but no, the fact of the matter is, it's like the ideas that you have here are just very much it's fascinating just how it really points to just how almost uninspired any American adaptation of Godzilla, even no matter how good it is, how solid it can be as an adventure film, how uninspired it is in terms of doing something more like Honda did in the original film. I mean, we can discuss the 1998 Roland Emmerich Godzilla. I think they're significant. I think especially when I think you mentioned something about on Facebook a while back about how sort of Toho sort of took back that ridiculous iguana looking Godzilla as part of their monster legacy, and that just blew my mind, because it's like, okay, good on you, Toho. Good on you.
Yeah, it was in the it was in just so people might have a better idea here. So because like I said, there's 35 Godzilla films in the Toho era. Now the Toho era, even before I get into that, I wanted to say for those who are really interested in sort of exploring the history of the classic films, there are 3 great sites that could probably do a far better job than I can of talking about this. There's Toho Kingdom, Gojipedia, and Wikizilla. So these are 3 great sites that will go into detail. So what I'm about to say is kind of a thumbnail, just for purposes of the podcast. But so when most people talk about Godzilla, when you see commercials like that classic, Father's Day Godzilla song, the Godzilla ad, where it says it takes a man to be a dad. I don't know if you, but I'm sure it's aired in America. Most people are talking about the what's called the Showa era of Godzilla. So and because there's the Showa era, that's 54 to 75. Then there's the Heisei era, which is from 1984 to 1995. Then there's the Millennium Era, which is from 1999 to 2004. And then there's the post-Millennium Era, which began with Shin Godzilla, and it includes those Netflix animated Godzilla films. So, so just so people understand when I'm jumping from era to era. So, as far as that 98 Godzilla reference goes, it was in a movie that came out in the Millennium Era called Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters, All-Out Attack, which just rolls off the tip of your tongue.
Yeah, yeah.
And that film was directed by Shusuke Kaneko, who did the Gamera trilogy from the 90s. And so the scene, there's a scene at the beginning of the film where they talk about, there's rumors that Godzilla is back. And there's a scene where there's these two students talking to each other, and they say, and one student says, "Oh, I heard there was an attack by a similar creature. I heard there was an attack in New York in 1998 by Godzilla." And then the other student says, "Oh, yeah, I heard about that too, but I think it's a similar type creature that Americans seem to call Godzilla, but it's not actually Godzilla." And then Godzilla, the iguana there, he actually showed up in Godzilla Final Wars in 2004, and it's basically where Godzilla is fighting the entire rogues gallery of villains that he's facing. I think the fight literally lasts 20 seconds, where Godzilla just blows them away, fire, and that was the end of that. But it's interesting. So I guess technically you could argue that 98 film is part of the Toho continuity, because he does make an appearance. So so there was actually I'm just thinking about this now because I know you're a really big fan of his. So I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there's a film in '91, Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. This is from the Heisei era. And and if you haven't seen it, I would really recommend it. It's actually really one of the better ones to come out of the 90s, if for no other reason that it actually explains Godzilla's origin from the prehistoric era. So there's a scene where there's these two drill sergeants, and there's a UFO that passes by, and one of the sergeants turns to the other and he says, "Oh, I just saw a UFO." And then his superior says, "Are you telling me you had a close encounter of the third kind?" And then the guy says, and he says, if between you and me, I keep that to yourself. Tell it to your son when you get home, Sergeant Spielberg. With the idea, of course, that's where he got the idea. So that's, so yeah, I don't know how we got on there, but yeah, just. There's funny little moments like that where they make little references.
Right. No, and it's and when you brought up the going back to 2014 film a little bit, and the fact that it doesn't really explain Godzilla. I mean, I do think you have that opening newsreel sort of opening credits in that film that I guess is sort of the shorthand of, here's the quick cliff notes of how Godzilla came into being. Set to a pretty fantastic Alexander Desplat score, actually. I think that score for that film is phenomenal.
And that's something we didn't talk about with the classic films, but yeah, that was definitely one of the highlights of the 2014 film for sure. I really that, and it definitely gave the film a sense of drama that it might have been lacking from a script standpoint.
Yeah.
But then again, that whole prologue thing, that almost feels like the kind of thing you would throw on a second or third film to remind people.
Oh yeah,
remember what happened in the first film, like for a film that, especially since that was the film that. Because it is that film, right? It's because I know some people consider Kong Skull Island the official kickoff, but I think the 2014 is supposed to be the kickoff.
Yeah, the 2014 I think is supposed to be the first one of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so why it was just it was a little. I mean, aside from it being disappointing, it was just a little surprising that they wouldn't devote the film. In fact, if anything, I mean, like I would have just kept it to Godzilla himself just to establish who he is. Because again, as tedious as the origin stories can be, I really need to strongly believe that if you're kicking off a universe, you need to tell the story, and you shouldn't assume that everyone knows who Godzilla is. But then again, that's something I'm starting to notice about universe-driven films in general.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of reasons why I sort of tuned out of the Marvel universe after a while, because it seemed like for some of the superheroes, they just assumed that people knew the story and didn't bother trying to establish who these people were.
Right.
But at the same time, to avoid coming off as a quote unquote old man yelling at a cloud, um, I do want to state for the record that for me, as much as Godzilla will always be a uniquely, pardon me, a uniquely Japanese thing, I don't begrudge today's generation for enjoying, the MonsterVerse films, or the
Yeah.
MCU, anything like that. Like, if I was in the peak of when I was really into things like this, or if I was growing up and this was my first experience to Godzilla, I mean, I would be. When you really stop and think about it, in our generation, as far as Japanese Godzilla films go, there have really only been three theatrical releases. There was, Godzilla '85, Godzilla 2000, and then Shin Godzilla from 2016.
Yeah.
These kids these days, they're getting, Godzilla films every year.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I mean, I'm very happy for them, and if these films help the younger generations discover the classic film, then all the better. I really don't have any problem with that. It's just, I mean, I recently turned 37, so I've accepted the fact that I'm no longer part of the demographic that these students cater to anymore.
Yeah.
So I do want to. I would like to say that I do think it's great
Mhm.
that these films are being made. I just I just wish there was a little more substance there, but
No,
they
you're
seem.
absolutely right about that. And it's funny because of the fact that I after I rewatched the 2014 film, I did watch the 1998 Roland Emmerich film, and it's funny they both open with the same type of newsreel introduction.
They do, don't they? Oh yeah,
They do.
they do.
Now, granted, I do think while it does have its issues, I do think the 2014 film is a considerably better film than Roland Emmerich's film. Roland Emmerich's film is atrocious.
Oh yeah. Well, see, that's the thing. I mean, the one thing about the 2014 film that I will give it credit is that at least they gave Godzilla it gave Godzilla a sense of gravitas
Yeah.
that hadn't been seen until since like the original Godzilla film, I would say. Whereas the '98 film, was a lot of mugging for the camera. I mean, that was probably a lot to do with Roland Emmerich's inept direction. But that film, people kind of felt like you could tell that a lot of people were sort of slumming it in the sense that
and I think it doesn't help that Roland Emmerich, I guess, was sort of on record around at the time, because this was something I saw on IMDb when I was looking at the trivia, is that he's not a Godzilla fan. And it's like, I think they just gave him that movie because he had just come off of Independence Day.
Yep, that's right.
And like, you can tell that he's not a Godzilla fan because he doesn't take the movie seriously at all. I mean, the thing is, one of the things that struck me about that film is, like, with the exception of maybe Jean Reno, there's really, like, every major character in that movie is played by an actor primarily known for comedy.
That's right, because
And
Matthew
it's like-
Broderick's like the star of the film, which
Yeah.
always struck me as a bit of an odd choice. I mean, not a knock against him as an actor, but
Oh no, he
he's not.
can be a fantastic actor, but it's like, really? And it didn't occur to me until it was like, wow, like, so many of these people are better known for comedy. What are they doing in this?
Yeah. The one thing that I kind of got a kick out of in that film, if I remember correctly, was that the mayor it was Mayor Ebert, right?
Yeah,
Like, there were two
basically,
characters.
the mayor and, like, his deputy were basically parodies of Siskel and Ebert.
Yeah, that's what that's the thing I think I remember the most.
Yeah.
From those two characters, yeah.
Yeah.
And because they get squashed by Godzilla at some point, so
Yeah, basically.
yeah, that's probably. But I remember growing up during that whole advertising campaign. I mean, if
Mm.
nothing, the triumph in advertising, how they really had people's anticipation built up to a fever pitch.
Yeah.
They never showed Godzilla at all, which of course in retrospect I think we all know why, because I don't think it would have had the box office that it would have had if they had revealed him beforehand.
Right.
But I remember the campaign for that and seeing the bus ads and everything, and we were all really excited about that one.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had mentioned Godzilla 2000. I actually did see that one in theaters.
Yep.
And it's goofy and but it's actually I recently, because I actually bought it on Blu-ray, and it's got both the American cut that I saw in theaters as well as the Japanese cut, which is about 10 minutes longer. And it's like, it really, the Japanese, it's amazing they're both fundamentally the same film, but it's amazing how much more the Japanese film, just how much more weight the Japanese film has, even if it's just a matter of, 10 extra minutes. I mean, it's still goofy, it's still strange. Like that villain is the sentient rock that's basically the spaceship, and it's still crazy to think about that, but
Well, what I remember the most about, because I remember seeing Godzilla 2000 in the theaters, it was obviously the English dub. I think what I remember the most about that were two lines that you could tell they weren't in the Japanese script, but they obviously threw them in the American one. There's a line, I think, where the army is they're in a war room and they start arguing, and then one of the guys says, "Hey, you can't fight in here. This is the war room," which is they took a lot from Doctor Strangelove.
Yeah.
And then of course the infamous line that I think a lot of diehards remember. They're talking about how they can defeat Godzilla, and they've got this special missile.
Yep.
And it said, and one person says, this missile will go through Godzilla like crap through
goose. That is a line that has never left my memory since I saw it in 2000. I laughed my ass off during that movie at that moment. And if you watch the Japanese dub, so that second line is sort of kind of in there, but it's obviously you need the ridiculous English dub for it to be really hilarious.
Oh yeah, I mean that's definitely makes the
but yeah,
the joke.
Yeah, that line never left my memory after seeing that movie in theaters. It's it was so I just laughed my ass off during that. It's yeah.
No, that I remember. Yeah, there's because some of these films, I mean, fortunately, we're living in a time where a lot of these films are being released uncut with the Japanese language track. But some of the from the 90s, unfortunately, the only versions that seem to be available for the moment are the English dubs.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I prefer the Japanese version to the English dub, there's one English dub track that if you haven't had a chance to watch it, I would highly recommend it, because I'm so conflicted, because on one hand, the film itself is really tremendous and probably one of the best ones to come out of this era, but the English dub does the film such a disservice. It's almost a work of art just to watch how dubbing can completely destroy a movie. It's Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2 from 1993. I think you could find it on Blu-ray. Actually, it's not out of print. It's just the voices that I'm always very curious about how they go about casting voices for actors, because the voices are completely mismatched. You really should just watch it for yourself. It's really spectacular to watch, because I still want to try to find a Japanese version one day, because you could tell, if you try to see beyond the dubbing, you could tell there's a really good film there.
Right.
But it's almost like they're dubbing a different movie. It has nothing to do with what's happening on the screen.
That would be sort of my big hope, especially if Criterion has the rights to the Toho movies. It would be great to have Because I know for the Ishiro Honda Godzilla for the Criterion release, they have both the original Japanese cut as well as Godzilla King of the Monsters, the Raymond Burr cut, and
Hmm.
just being able to have both of those, in the same thing. I would like to hope that that would be a side effect of somebody like Criterion having the rights to something like that they would make both versions available. That would be fantastic.
Well, because I've got the complete Japanese collection on DVD, like all the classic, the 29 films, not including the other ones, the animes. And I know before they were released on Criterion, there was a company called Classic Media which released all the original run of Godzilla films, all the
Mm-hmm.
Shiro, and they actually do have the Japanese and the American versions. And I do want to say, as much as we've been having some fun at the expense of the American dub versions, you're right in the sense that it would be good to keep them, if nothing else, as a time capsule to show the difference between like what happens when a film is bought by an American exploitation distributor and how
Yeah.
they try to because again, it's a wonderful, almost like a little mini film school on how to edit and reappropriate footage to fit a certain agenda. And because in many respects, some of these films take on different meanings altogether. And one of the things too is that, and this is going to sound sacrilege, but for the film King Kong versus Godzilla, I actually prefer the U.S. version to the Japanese version because um, now some of that might be nostalgia because I grew up watching that version,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the way it differs from the Japanese one is that the U.S. version they rescored the film using tracks from the Universal Library. So they used tracks from Creature from the Black Lagoon,
Okay.
and they also have the film. The story is often interrupted by these scenes with talking heads, where they're talking about the history, like Godzilla and Kong, and it's very it's almost like education films from the 40s and 50s. Very stilted delivery.
Yeah.
But that's the version and again maybe that's because that's the first Godzilla film I ever owned. I'll always have a certain affinity for that version.
Yeah.
When I watched the Japanese version, it was an entirely different experience, and I actually found myself not enjoying it as much because I was quite surprised when Kong and Godzilla eventually have their big fight at the end. The American version really their choice of really amplified the drama and excitement, whereas in the Japanese version, I realized that there were a number of moments in that climactic fight scene where there wasn't any score at all, which kind
Hmm.
of took away from the movie. But I'm sure I'm in the minority on that one. I'm sure most people would hang me for for suggesting that the American version was better. But that's a rare example of how I kind of prefer
Yeah.
that one. Um, Also, another, by that same token, a film like Godzilla in 1985, which the longest time was only available with the Raymond Burr inserted scenes because Raymond Burr comes back in this film, and because
That's right. I
in
forgot
the
about that.
yeah, but you know how in Godzilla King of the Monsters, his character's name was Steve Martin.
Yes.
In Godzilla 1985, he's just referred to as Mr. Martin for obvious reasons
Yeah.
because by that Steve Martin was Steve Martin.
Yeah.
But I, but So again, the U.S. version is another version that I have quite a bit of fondness for, just because it was the one I remember renting from my local video store,
Mm-hmm.
and also I'll never forget all the blatant Dr. Pepper product placement. Where it's pretty notorious because they don't
Mm.
really try to hide the fact that that film sponsored the American dub. But then I finally watched the Japanese version, and again, it's an entirely different experience. And while I do prefer the Japanese version ultimately, I still do kind of like the U.S. version.
Right.
And it's kind of a shame because the DVD that I have of Godzilla in 1985, they didn't include the English cut,
Mm.
which is a shame, because I do feel like that was a fun take on the movie, and it seems like it's lost to the ages now.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen Godzilla 1985, but yeah, I do remember Raymond Burr coming back for. Remember reading or hearing that Raymond Burr came back for that one.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think, and one of the things that I think, especially if you have access to like American versions versus the Japanese versions and stuff like that. I mean, it's sort of the same way with anime, and especially like with Miyazaki, where it's like, especially with animation, it's like I can see if you wanted to show somebody something like Kiki's Delivery Service or Princess Mononoke or Spirited Away to try to get them into Miyazaki, but they're not really into foreign films. You have really, you have the American dub versions that can sort of usher them into those films to where, maybe on their own they start to watch them with the subtitles and stuff like that and get into a little bit more of world cinema. And I think that's one of the things that's really, I think that sort of would be an interesting after effect of something like of having the Godzilla movies be the way they are and be available in the way they are, where it's like you could introduce people could sort of get into world cinema and foreign films in a way that they may not necessarily do otherwise.
That's a fantastic example, and I'm actually really glad you brought that up about anime, because yes, I think for a lot of people who are getting into anime, most people would probably start off with the English dubs. And in the case of the Miyazaki films, that's an example of while people might not like dubbing as a general rule, the dubbing, I think, for those films is taken a lot more seriously than dubbing for the old Godzilla films was, because in the sense that it had established actors who get top billing in the movie. And in fact, I would some people go out of their way to seek the English dubs of those films, just because it's almost like watching a different version of the film altogether, because you have these well-known and good actors too. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know, like, for example, I grew up watching Dragon Ball, and as much as and I find myself drawn more to the English dub than the original Japanese version, just because that's what I grew up listening to. So I recognize the voices, and I have a lot of nostalgic value attributed to the voices.
Right.
And I mean, again, like I think if they do, and if Criterion ends up re-releasing all these films on Blu-ray, it might be in their best interest to include both versions, if for no other reason than to help introduce people to these Japanese films or introduce people who would otherwise not seek out these kinds of movies.
Yeah,
and I suspect that they would. I mean, especially a company like Criterion, they're usually really thorough with their releases, so I wouldn't be surprised that they would include versions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean that's one of the reasons why I would like to. Now, I mean, with everything going to streaming now, I mean that gets a little bit more problematic, unfortunately. And it's like it's one of the, and I think something like what Criterion does with so many of its releases, whether you're talking about Godzilla, whether you're talking about Tarkovsky films or Bergman films or Truffaut, and the way that they package all of those with multiple versions, multiple different cuts of them, and I just being able to have all of those resources available to it. That's important to what physical media can do over streaming. I think. I mean, streaming is cheaper for the company, obviously, for a lot of reasons, but at the same time, as far as production, but it's like, I still would like to have access to, all of these different versions of these films.
Yeah, that's something that seems to be getting lost as we transition from physical media to streaming, because yeah, you're right. I mean, one of the things I miss about physical media are things like audio commentary, because you don't really get those with streaming services. You know, they'll usually just include the basic version of the film, depending on what streaming service you use. But yeah, because I mean, as I've documented pretty well on my social media, I mean, for one circumstance or another, I've had to sell off parts of my collection here and there, and you know, some of those situations have been heartbreaking. Others not so much, because films are available on Netflix or Amazon Prime. But you know, sometimes if I rewatch, let's say, a film like Clerks on a I find myself wishing I still had the DVD, because the DVD had, you know, Kevin Smith's wonderful commentary, which in many respects was just as entertaining to watch, if not more so, than the film itself.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, that does to be something that's lost in the process. I don't know if it's a question of bandwidth or if they would have to charge a premium service, but it would be good if they included the extras that would otherwise have been put on a Blu-ray or DVD.
Yeah. No, absolutely. See. Trying to think if I had anything else I wanted to say on the topic of Godzilla and any of the films in particular. I'm not sure that I do. Did you have anything more that you wanted to talk about?
Well. I mean, again, when it comes to Godzilla, we could do a Joe Rogan style podcast where I could talk for hours about this. But I will maybe I could throw out some recommendations for people who might want to seek out some of these films.
Yeah.
So again, we've been talking a lot about the classic era, but they were making Godzilla films in the 90s as well as the early part of the 21st century. And so some interesting films that people might want to seek out. One of them is actually just came out in 2016 called Shin Godzilla. It was directed by the two creators behind the whole Neon Genesis Evangelion anime series.
Okay.
This is actually a really interesting film because so I might need to backtrack a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, like Godzilla is broken up into different eras. What characterizes each era is that it'll start off with a film that completely ignores everything that came before it, except for the original film.
Yeah.
So but what's interesting about Shin Godzilla is that I hesitate to call it a remake, because it doesn't really remake the 54 film in as much as it just completely ignores it altogether and creates a new type of Godzilla in its own distinct universe. And I find the film, it's a little on the long side. I mean, it is 2 hours, and as much as I love Godzilla, there's no reason for a Godzilla film to be more than 90 minutes.
Yeah.
But so it is long, but it's a brilliant satire of government bureaucracy. So, because I think the film was meant to be sort of a metaphor for how the Japanese government reacted to the events in Fukushima.
Okay.
And so basically, when Godzilla makes his presence known, there's this montage where the government is having meetings about setting future meetings to discuss how to deal with Godzilla. So, you know, there'll be a meeting and they'll be like, okay, let's break off into a smaller meeting. And then they have the smaller meeting. We need to have another meeting about what's the best way to defeat Godzilla. And then they have that meeting, and then there's another meeting. So it's really funny. I mean, my only criticism of that would be it's almost too preoccupied with the satire element, to the point where sometimes where you could theoretically have taken Godzilla out of that film and replaced it with any sort of natural disaster. But I think it's worth checking out, because it's really the only Godzilla film that kind of captures a bit of the spirit of the 54 film, in that it ties Godzilla to a real life natural disaster. And it's, you know, in many respects, a scathing criticism of how government should be a little more streamlined, especially when disaster strikes. You know, we shouldn't have meeting after meeting to discuss how to deal with that.
Right.
So that's worth checking out. Also, I mean, it's worth checking out for no other reason than, I mean, there was originally supposed to be a sequel plan, but they've sort of abandoned that, and they talked about doing their own version of a Marvel universe where it's going to be more of a throwback to the classic era where you're having all these monsters fighting each other. So it's really a unique, excuse me, a unique take on Godzilla.
Yeah.
Also, so there's that. Um, from the Millennium era, the 99 to 2004 era, I would definitely recommend checking out Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. It's directed by Shusuke Kaneko, who did the Gamera films from the 90s.
Okay.
Um, it's a wonder. It's Godzilla is once again the villain, and it's interesting because this version of Godzilla seems to be. They talk about one of the reasons why Godzilla is immortal and impervious to pain is because Godzilla is said to be possessed by the victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks. So he's basically comprised of the ghosts of everyone who lost their lives. And so that's kind of interesting, and it's also King Ghidorah for the first time is portrayed as a villain, as a hero. He's one of the good guys that fights Godzilla. So that's a really interesting dynamic. And also, the film, by the time you get to the end, there's a scene where they salute the heroes like Mothra, King Ghidorah, and Baragon, who defeat Godzilla, and it's pretty emotional. You actually genuinely care for these creatures. You it's a really job of making you feel for them the same way you would feel for any sort of human character.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something worth checking out. And also, we didn't get a chance to mention this one. This is from the classic era. There's Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, directed by Yoshimitsu Banno. And this is a film that you either love or hate it. I really enjoyed it for no other reason than it's really different to the point where it almost has a David Lynchian quality to it. That's probably the first time I ever mentioned David Lynch and Godzilla in the same sentence. But so that one's really worth checking out. There's animation in that movie, and also it's probably the closest thing we're ever going to get to seeing Godzilla versus Gamera, because at some point the Smog Monster kind of turns into a Gamera type creature where he's got rocket jets and flying around, and so that makes for a fun visual.
Huh.
And other other than that, I mean, it's a wonderful series, the longest running franchise of any series that I can think of, and it's a lot of fun. I mean,
Yeah.
I think part of the appeal of especially of the '54 Godzilla film, is that whether you're a fan of Hollywood films, whether you're the snootiest of art film fans, everyone would have to agree, at the very least, that the original film has merit and deserves to be sort of mentioned alongside, some of the great classics in film history. And I think if you go in with an open mind, and you'll be very surprised. There's lots of treasures to dig.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, it's definitely a franchise I plan on trying to dig into more, and it's one that is the movies I have seen of it I've enjoyed, even if they're kind of delve really into the ridiculous. But I think there's also, that's part of what makes them fun, is just how ridiculous it can be to watch those. But yeah, like you said, the Ishiro Honda film is one of the greatest films of all time. I think you can make a legitimate case for it, and it was a landmark for, in much the same way that the original King Kong was. And so I think, and even more so, based on the narrative heft that Honda brings to that film. But yeah, I mean, those are a lot of good suggestions there, and I'm definitely looking forward to our discussion on Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris, which debuted at the Toronto Film Festival. I think in 1999. So that is why it is getting included in the Class of '99 series, and I'm definitely looking forward to that talk.
Oh yeah,
continue this discussion.
yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun too.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for joining me today as we discuss Godzilla, the history of Godzilla, the history of Godzilla in American films, and sort of how that has evolved over the years. This was a lot of fun to have.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I'll never turn down an opportunity to talk about Godzilla.
I'd like to thank Matthew for joining me today. We're going to have another discussion coming up on the 1999 film Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris for the Class of 1999 series. So be on the lookout for that podcast too. Join me at sonic-cinema.com. In early April, we're going to be covering the Atlanta Film Festival from April 4th through April 14th. I'm really looking forward to that opportunity. There's going to be plenty of reviews and hopefully some interviews on Sonic Cinema for that. Also, check out patreon.com/Sonic Cinema for more with that, as well as extra content for patrons, and also the Sonic Cinema YouTube channel where the podcast as well as quick takes will be housed. For now, this is Brian Scuttle, and thank you very much for joining me.